Well, good morning. It's 9:30 on the button, so welcome very much to the launch of the IISS Armed Conflict Survey 2017, which provides data and analysis of the military, political, and humanitarian dimensions of the world's many armed conflicts. It includes maps, infographics, and our highly regarded chart of armed conflict to illustrate key trends, as well as thematic essays by some of the world's leading experts on conflict. This is the third edition of the Armed Conflict Survey, and it draws on data from the IISS Armed Conflict Database, which monitors the world's active armed conflicts on a daily basis and is gaining increasing attention from governments, militaries, intelligence agencies, and international organizations. Those of you interested in trying out the database are invited to do so at the end of this meeting. We have terminals in the room. The essays in this year's Armed Conflict Survey are on the fate of UN peacekeeping, on conflict-related sexual violence, the Islamic State's shifting narrative, the changing foundation of governance by armed groups, and rebel-to-party transitions. I'm delighted first to welcome Professor Mats Berdahl, a former Director of Studies here at the IISS and author of the essay on UN peacekeeping, who will speak in a few moments. Joining him on this stage is Dr. Anastasia Vonkova, editor of the Armed Conflict Survey, Emil Hokayem, Senior Fellow for Middle East Security, and Antonio Champao, Research Analyst for Security and Development. Other staff members who contributed to this year's book are in the front row and available for comment. The changed layout of the room this year reflects, I think, a desire on our part to make this more of a discussion meeting than a press-focused launch, although I do hope that the journalists here present will find plenty of material to furnish an article or two. And to that end, I will spend, in a moment, 10 minutes outlining some of our principal conclusions in the 2017 edition of the Armed Conflict Survey, which together with the thoughts of Professor Mats Berdahl, I trust will provide an excellent basis for a lively discussion. But first, Mats on UN peacekeeping and the essay in your book.
Well, thank you very much, John. Let me first say it's a very great pleasure to be back at the ISS. As John mentioned, I've been here for the better part of my working life. And indeed, when John first asked me to write on whether UN peacekeeping, it was the summer of 1992. And you may remember that, John. The result was in a Delphi paper published the following year, when the strains and stresses, as well as the limitations of traditional UN peacekeeping, were being very cruelly exposed in Angola, Somalia, Bosnia, and soon to be, and most catastrophically of all, in Rwanda. Now, those failures, culminating in the fall of Srebrenica in eastern Bosnia, led to a period of retrenchment in UN peacekeeping before a new period of growth starting in 1999. And in terms of numbers and budgets, that upward trend has continued more or less unabated since. Now, why do I mention this? Well, it's not just to show that I've retained my good looks, nor is it to demonstrate the shelf life of the Delphi papers, though of course it does both of those two things as well. But it's rather to point to elements of continuity and break in the history of UN peacekeeping over that period, to some of the lessons that have not been learned from those experiences, and by extension, of course, to identify the challenges before us to ask whether UN peacekeeping. Let me now be quite telegraphic in my conclusions and summary for the paper, and then you can go and look at it later. I'll be quite brief. Let me start with continuity and what has not fundamentally changed. Now, peacekeeping operations today continue to be hampered by the kind of inbuilt weaknesses to the UN system for mounting, managing and sustaining operations that have historically bedeviled these operations. The lack of key enabling capacities in engineering, communications, intelligence, aviation, and logistics. It has no strategic or ready reserves, and the quality of troops is highly uneven. this is compounded, as it has always been. It seems almost impossible to reform this aspect of it, a dysfunctional system for financial and human resource management. Now, all of this impedes unity of effort and operational effectiveness. Now, I'm saying this not because we're short of ideas. Indeed, we had another huge paper looking at the challenges of UN peacekeeping, the HIPPO report, the High-Level Panel on Peace Operations. But I'm saying because we have to recognize, and I think I said that back in 1992, that there are real limits to how you can make a UN force effective, and that, or those limitations come from the intergovernmental and the intensely political nature of the UN as an organization. There isn't much you can do about that. Now, in a relatively benign, or what you might call a permissive operational environment, you can live with those kinds of limitations. But of course, and this is the second element of continuity to some extent from the early 90s, the environment is no longer benign. Indeed, the majority of UN peacekeeping operations, as you will all know, operate in what is euphemistically called or classed as non-permissive or high-tempo and insecure environments. The 5 largest, and also, as it happens, the most troubled UN missions today in the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, Darfur, Mali, Central African Republic, and South Sudan, are all deployed in conditions of civil war. That is, in conditions where power, resources, and governmental authority are fundamentally contested, and in consequence, where there is often very little peace to keep. And taken together, those 4 missions account for some 85,000 of the total of number of personnel serving in the UN flag. And these conditions, as I said, are conditions of civil war. Now, this combination of these 2 factors, of structural weakness and operating in a civil war-like setting, has created strains, and I hate to use this word again, crisis. We always talk about crisis, but they have created strains and crises that belie the language of government communiques and General Assembly opening statements, where you always hear about the health and vitality and importance of peacekeeping. In fact, peacekeeping, I would argue, is faced with very serious systemic and mission-specific challenges. And then the question is, how did it come to this? And here I come to, if you like, elements of break or discontinuity over this past 20 years. How did it come to this, you might argue, after the horrendous lessons of 92 and 95? And here I think there are 2 trends which I spend a little bit of time on in my thematic essay, which are central to the history of UN peacekeeping over the last 15 years. And both of them have to do in a direct and indirect way with the horrors of the early 1990s. The genocide in Rwanda, the experience in Bosnia, led to a strong sense, inchoate but nonetheless real, that this should never again happen on the UN watch. It also, of course, coincided with what you might call a normative shift, which may not be evident to everyone today, but nonetheless, the language has changed and moved. We talk about the responsibility to protect, and if nothing else, there is a sense that if civilians are being persecuted, if there is a danger that mass atrocity crimes will take place, we have some sense of obligation and responsibility to intervene. Now, that has led to 2 things since 1999. The first of all is that the protection of civilians, which was not a core role of peacekeeping traditionally, has become a core function. Indeed, every UN operation, bar one, since 1991, has had POC, as we call it, protection of civilians, as a core mandate. And indeed, it's central to the 5 largest missions I mentioned earlier. At the same time, and this is the second trend, there's been an increased focus on what's sometimes called muscular or robust peacekeeping. That particular trend, which we've seen in action, if you like, early on in Sierra Leone in 1990, in the DRC in between 2003 and 2005, in Haiti, when the UN attacked, if you like, the gang structures in Port-au-Prince, culminated with the creation of the so-called Force Intervention Brigade, many of you will have heard of, in the DRC in 2013. It culminated because this Force Intervention Brigade was exceptionally given a mandate to take offensive actions within the context of the peacekeeping operations against armed groups in the eastern DRC. And there is on the table, but the Security Council can't seem to agree on it, a proposal for a similar force to go to South Sudan, whether or not that's a good idea. Now, the record of robust peacekeeping and of protection of civilians over this period is decidedly and that's me being very polite, mixed. And indeed, you could argue that we are at the precipice of potentially very major crises, at least in two missions, DRC and in South Sudan. Why has it been so mixed? So first of all, because the operational environment to which I referred is very demanding. It's a full-scale civil war, limited resources, and unquality of troops. You only need to take DRC, which I believe still has less than, I can't remember quite how much paved road there is in DRC or the Sudan, but we are talking about territories larger than Western Europe. And within that piece of territory, even large UN forces are entirely unable to provide protection of civilians, even if they want to. But of course, the second and more serious problem, particularly when UN missions are deployed over a long period of time, is that in a civil war setting, civil war here as a structural condition, rather than, if you like, the number of bullets flying around, in those settings, it's impossible for the UN to remain above the political fray. The UN is drawn into the politics, and relations between the UN mission and the host government in particular inevitably deteriorates, even though formally the consent is there. And just look at the DRC today, which is precisely the situation. A very poor relationship between the host government and the UN, and you could really ask whether there is any effectiveness of having the mission there at all. With regard to the use of force over this period, there have been some, what you might call, or what I would call, limited tactical successes, where under very special circumstances, and we can talk about that if there are questions later, the UN has been able to respond to immediate crises and emergencies. But very rarely have these limited successes against marginal spoilers been translated into strategic gain, simply because the UN is very poor at exploiting those for strategic gain. And I think the lesson of the Force Intervention Brigade is perhaps very telling in this. It is, in short, has been a failure. What it does now amounts, in the word of one UN official, to whacking moles in eastern DRC. There are more than 70 armed groups. It has proliferated since then. And those they have targeted, initially successfully, the M23, you may be familiar with, the Rwanda-backed force, which I think you have written about, Anastasia, has now made a comeback. And indeed, worse than that, over this period that the FIB has been there, the predation against civilians in Eastern Congo has anything increased. So I said I would be brief, and I've gone over my time. Let me just simply conclude, and we can talk perhaps later or after the session. Where does this leave us? Now, John will remember that we together visited Sarajevo back in 1994, and we met a very bright UN official there, Thant Mint. Remember, Thant is a grandson of the great Secretary General in the 1960s who took over after Hammarskjöld. Now, he has written recently, and I think there is something to this, he has suggested that we have become accustomed to thinking of UN peacekeeping as the core activity of the UN. And of course, in a sense it is. That's what we must spending money on. 115,000 people are deployed. But why should it be the core activity? Shouldn't it instead be trying to find, and maybe this is what Guterres has in mind, incidentally, he doesn't appear to be very keen on peacekeeping, I should say. Maybe that comes from his experience of running the UNHCR. Shouldn't the core activity be to focus for the UN on political mediation and diplomatic efforts to try to find political pathways to peace? There is much to be said for that viewpoint, I think, partly because ultimately the protection of civilians will not be resolved by military means. It will come about once you have an underlying and inclusive political settlement on the ground. The UN has been preoccupied with trying to find technical fixes to these very deep political problems, and until it starts to readdress that balance, it is going to be difficult. I will just end on a final, perhaps not entirely satisfactory note, and that is back to my point about this normative shift that has taken place. In spite of what I've said, it sounds nice, let's focus on the politics. Difficult judgments will have to be made when people are under threat of mass atrocity crimes. I mentioned South Sudan and I mentioned the DRC. I spoke to a senior official from the Central African Republic, which in many ways is a catastrophic area, but she insisted, and I think she's right, that the UN, in spite of everything, has saved life over the past couple of years there. That judgment is going to be very, very difficult to make. But I do think there is much to be said from reorienting the efforts of the UN towards political mediation and efforts to try to find, as I said, political pathways to peace.
Matt, thank you very much. And I do recall very well our conversation in the summer of 1992. Sounds like a Bryan Adams song or something. But I remember you came to me wanting to talk about nuclear deterrence. And I said, Matt, we've got lots of people at IISS who are good on nuclear deterrence. You need to look at UN peacekeeping with a UN peacekeeping. And I'm glad that you agreed with that proposal, because in the last quarter century, you've, of course, made the subject of UN peacekeeping very much your own. And thank you very much for returning to the IISS to give us your latest thoughts. Back now to the headlines, then, of the IISS Armed Conflict Survey 2017. So we judge that fatalities in the world's conflicts declined for a second successive year in 2016 to 157,000 from 167,000 in 2015 and 180,000 in 2014. Yet the death toll was still elevated by the standards of the previous decade, and there was little evidence of a trend towards peace. Indeed, an increasing number of conflicts bear the hallmarks of intractability, and with the potential to flare at short notice, we style them simmering conflicts. The war in Syria remained the world's most lethal conflict, with a further 50,000 deaths there, bringing the total since 2011 to around 290,000, more than twice the number recorded in the 4-year fratricidal conflict in Bosnia in the 1990s. Syria accounted for over 60% of the 82,000 conflict deaths recorded in the Middle East and North Africa region, which remained the most lethal region of the world. Fatalities in Latin America rose to 39,000 in 2016 from 34,000 1 year earlier, while fatalities in sub-Saharan Africa fell to 15,000 from 24,000 in 2015. The decline was so sharp that Africa returned to a lower fatality count than South and Central Asia for the first year since 2012. And the main driver of this decline was a near 70% fall in fatalities relating to Nigeria-based insurgent group Boko Haram, which previously had accounted for almost half of all conflict fatalities in sub-Saharan Africa. In Eastern Africa, by contrast, fatalities rose in Sudan's internal conflicts, while al-Shabaab continued to prosecute its battle for territory in southern Somalia, and hopes for peace in South Sudan all but disappeared. Afghanistan's increasing death toll kept fatalities in South and Central Asia at the level of 19,000. Fatalities in Europe fell to around 1,000 in 2016 from 4,500 1 year earlier, thanks to the imposition of a shaky truce in eastern Ukraine. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan claimed 17,000 and 16,000 lives, respectively, in 2016, although in lethality they were surpassed by the conflict in Mexico, which has received much less attention from the media and the international community. Mexico was the world's second most lethal conflict in 2016, with 23,000 fatalities. This result is all the more surprising and perhaps depressing for the fact the conflict does not feature the artillery, tanks, fighter jets, and bombers seen in the other high-intensity conflicts that we analyze. Nearly all the deaths in Mexico come as a result of the use of small arms. In the last 10 years, the government has succeeded in breaking the largest cartels, which posed an existential threat to the state. But in their wake, violence has soared. In 2016, fatalities rose in 22 of Mexico's 32 states. The largest rises were registered in states that were key battlegrounds for control between criminal cartels that are increasingly fragmented. The violence grew worse as the cartels expanded their territorial reach, seeking to cleanse areas of rivals in their efforts to secure a monopoly on drug trafficking routes and other criminal assets. Breaking the cycle of violence has proven difficult. A sweeping reform of the police to reduce corruption and boost capacity is long overdue. And also necessary is improvement of intelligence capabilities, better coordination among different security agencies in Mexico and neighboring states. Yet Mexico's president has had little success, unfortunately, in forcing through such changes. Mexico is not the only criminal conflict with a death toll that might surprise. Combined fatalities for Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala amounted to nearly 16,000 last year, with El Salvador experiencing its second most violent year since 1999, even though in 2016 these countries established new agencies and approaches to attempt to reduce criminal groups' influence. The high number of fatalities reflected the significant presence, firepower, and organizational capacity of rival gangs Mara Salvatrucha and Barrio 18. Collectively, these gangs, alongside smaller ones, had between 54,000 and 85,000 members spread across urban areas in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, according to estimates made by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime and by the US State Department in 2012. In late 2016, regional governments took a potentially important step to improve cooperation by establishing a tri-national force to share intelligence and coordinate operations. Fierce persecution of gangs and mass detention of members has been tried, however, with little success. This approach has now given way to a more targeted method using paramilitary structures and tactics. However, these can best be understood as measures that will contain the violence and just buy time. A lasting solution would require police and judicial reform in Central America, as well as tackling the socioeconomic problems that nurtured and sustained the gangs. Although global conflict fatalities edged down in 2016, civilians caught amid conflict arguably suffered more than in the preceding years. Between January and August 2016, 900,000 people were internally displaced in Syria. The number of new internally displaced persons, or IDPs, in Iraq and Afghanistan during the same period reached 234,000 and 260,000 respectively. The latest figures on refugee movements to non-Western countries demonstrate that the long-term trend of refugees settling in urban centers is now being amplified by mass displacement as a result of the Syrian conflict. Around 90% of Syrian refugees have settled in urban and peri-urban centers in neighboring countries, according to data published by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. This trend marks an important shift away from the more traditional pattern of hosting refugees in designated refugee camps, frequently placed along border regions. This reflects several advantages that urban areas actually have over rural camps: better educational and economic opportunities for refugees, as well as improved security and greater scope for engaging support networks for the displaced. Moreover, it creates new challenges by placing unprecedented pressure on socioeconomic infrastructure while increasing uncertainty for host communities, aid agencies, and governments. Refugees are thus more dispersed, and so it becomes more difficult sometimes to track them and therefore more difficult to assist them. As displaced people have moved into cities, so too has conflict. Approximately half of the 36 conflicts featured in the Armed Conflict Survey 2017, and all of the high-intensity ones, have a significant urban component. If in the past a typical insurgent fought in the mountains, forest, or jungle, today she or he is likely to be found in an urban setting. Turkey's conflict with the Kurdish Workers' Party, PKK for instance, became both more lethal and more urban in 2016. The number of recorded fatalities in the conflict reached 3,000, the highest level since 1997. The PKK and the government engaged in trench warfare in southern population centers. A surge in attacks on cities and public places put civilians in greater danger. Likewise, the conflict in South Sudan touched urban areas in the southern regions of the country. And in Afghanistan, the Taliban extended its strategy of carrying out suicide attacks in urban centers. The group conducted one of the deadliest of these operations in Kabul in April 2016, killing at least 64 people and injuring 347 others. Similarly, most of the high casualty attacks in Pakistan, many of them sectarian in nature, occurred in urban areas. Siege warfare also played a more prominent role in 2016, as the Iraqi state and its allies recaptured cities from the Islamic State, also known as ISIS or ISIL, and took steps towards freeing Mosul. In Libya, the operation to drive ISIS out of Sirte led to prolonged urban warfare, and in Syria, the siege of Aleppo favored the forces of the President Bashar al-Assad. The tactic proved cruel but effective, taking a very heavy toll on civilians. According to an estimate by independent monitor Siege Watch, by the end of October 2016, at least 1.3 million people were trapped in 39 besieged areas in Syria. In 2016, ISIS lost nearly 1/4 of the territory that it controlled in Iraq and Syria. Seemingly, the group lost fighters at a still faster rate. According to one estimate, in July 2016, the group had around 12,000 members compared to the US Department of Defense's headcount of 31,500 in 2014. The group's efforts to build a caliphate with the attributes of statehood appeared doomed. The losses suffered by ISIS underline the difficulties that any insurgent group faces in challenging a state conventionally, unless it has mass support and or powerful external backers, whether diaspora communities or other states. In the last few decades, only a few insurgent groups stand out as victorious over a state adversary, those in Kosovo, South Sudan, and Eritrea, and all to varying degrees enjoyed external military support. As a group with a defined territory and in possession of tanks and other conventional military platforms, ISIS presented, of course, an extensive target set for the coalitions that were ranged against it. The shrinking of the caliphate does not, however, mean that the group is an irrelevance. Its losses and likely defeat have underscored the utility for non-state groups in relying on insurgent and terrorist tactics rather than on conventional operations. The decline of ISIS heralds a new round of fragmentation among groups, a trend that actually results in greater brutality towards civilians. Already this phenomenon has been observed in the Sinai Peninsula, Somalia, and the Sahel, where there were lethal attacks last year on the Ivorian town of Grand Bassam and in Burkina Faso. I noted at the outset that conflict fatalities fell for a third successive year in 2016, but this should not be interpreted as a sign that conflict is receding. Many of the conflicts in the Armed Conflict Survey have been running for decades. Others of more recent vintage are now displaying the symptoms of intractability. These conflicts, often described as frozen, are better understood to be simmering and with the potential to boil over with little warning. Among the established ones, I would just note that the Philippines conflict with the New People's Army began in 1969. The conflict in southern Sudan started in 1983. Turkey's with the PKK in 1984. Myanmar's in 1985. And Eritrea's in 1993. India's internal conflicts have been running for several decades too. More recent conflicts, including those in Mali and Ukraine, seem to be developing similar characteristics to these chronic conflicts. In Mali and Ukraine, and also in northern India, there's been a failure to implement peace deals. Mainly this was because of the growing instability and sometimes apparent unwillingness of political actors substantially to address persistent rule of law and security problems. Although the failure to implement peace agreements has yet not resulted in a significant increase in violence, it has weakened the prospects for lasting peace and stability. Such conflicts can burn slowly for years, but then escalate alarmingly. And they can also do so with little notice, as the conflict in Kashmir reminded us in the second half of 2016. So finding the right policy responses to simmering conflicts will be a major challenge for heavily preoccupied policymakers, but essential if conflict fatalities around the world are to be reduced substantially. And in this area, as in so many others, good governance is a necessary precondition to good strategy. So with those opening remarks on the statistics and analysis contained in the Armed Conflict Survey 2017 and Max Bodal's excellent analysis on the present condition of UN peacekeeping, we invite questions or comments, and the others on the podium will be happy to deal with them. Yes, please.
Do you consider that in present circumstances the dismemberment of Iraq, Syria and Libya is now inevitable, and what will be the strategic consequences for the region?
Emil Hokaim, 3 countries.
Thank you. Good morning. I see big differences between those 3 conflicts. In Syria, I think it's fair to talk about de facto soft partition at this point, and the involvement of regional neighbors and great powers is large enough that you can see zones of control, of influence taking shape. In Iraq, despite the gruesomeness of the fight against ISIS, especially in Mosul, etc., there's still a state to speak of. I mean, it may be a weak state, it may be a state where political authority is challenged in Baghdad, etc., and we certainly see a weak but also federal state in Iraq. But in Syria, it's very difficult to talk about a state. In Libya, interestingly enough, in the past couple of weeks, we've seen UAE diplomacy trying to broker a deal between the Tripoli government and the Tobruk government. We'll see if that actually happens, but it's perhaps the most serious of all regional efforts at this point. And so even in Libya, of course, we can only envision a decentralized federal system, but I still wouldn't call it dismemberment. The point is that ultimately there will all be weak entities. It depends how weak. I mean, you know, where ultimate military control lies, you know, whether any of those states can actually meet the demands and the concerns of their neighbors, the international community, etc. But I do see significant differences between them. I just think Syria is much further fragmented than any of the others.
Over here.
Hi, my name's Professor Andrew Mcleod from King's College. I'm also a former soldier and former UN official. I direct my question to Matt, if I may, regarding peacekeeping and the challenges that peacekeeping faces. Is one of the unspoken problems the ethical and moral rot at the core of peacekeeping, particularly giving reference to the Secretary-General's statement in his 2016 review at the end of March that UN peacekeepers are responsible for 311 cases of child rape and sexual abuse, and they are just the known and reported cases, with the UN recognising that the number of victims are probably listed in the thousands each year, and that's only peacekeeping, not including UNICEF, UNDP, UNHCR, with more and more data coming out, that we've given so much freedom for malicious people to operate within UN structures that it's very difficult for us now to maintain an ethical framework where soldiers do understand their role to protect the very civilians they're abusing.
Matt.
Yeah, I think that is undoubtedly a challenge facing the UN, and indeed I noticed that there is a separate chapter on sexual violence in the paper. And I think you're right. I mean, the UN has repeatedly tried, and of course people have found fault at their efforts to try to address some of these issues. It's partly to do with, you remember I mentioned some of the structural difficulties of running these. When you give troops to the UN operations, you actually don't cede full control. Some of the disciplinary measures are not really something which the UN can enforce and deal with. They have set up offices of internal oversight to pursue this and trying to bring, but it's proven very, very difficult. And these issues are also, I think, partly related to the protracted nature of some of these deployments, the fact that the UN has struggled to find high-quality troops in many cases to these operations, and also that the nature of conflict in these areas, and again I refer back to the paper, I noticed there is a chapter by William Reno on the political economy of conflict in some of these protracted conflicts, and in a way the UN becomes, if not the part of the problem, certainly one aspect of that conflict, so it makes it difficult to address these issues. So I think you're right. I think one has to be perhaps slightly careful about. I mean, the thing with the UN, of course, by definition, it should uphold the very highest standards. So one is right to focus on these issues. But there are, of course, a number of contingents and troops that do make an extraordinary effort under very, very difficult circumstances. And what I mentioned with respect to the protection of civilians, they are literally being asked to cover an area in the DRC that is 2/3 the size of Western Europe with very, very limited resources. But I think we're coming to a kind of a crunch point here to ask, what is the most useful way of proceeding to deal with these issues? That is part of the mix, and it's inevitable that it might well come back.
Go ahead.
I take everything on board you're saying, particularly about troops being the responsibility of troop-providing countries. And I spent a lot of time in Central Africa myself. But more and more data is coming out about core UN staff. And to be frank, white Anglo-Saxon staff also participating in child rape. Yet there is zero prosecution of UN staff, let alone peacekeeping soldiers. And surely, until the UN does take it seriously, and surely until we, as the taxpayers that fund this, demand of our governments to actually prosecute our nationals that are doing this under the cloak of the UN, how can we ask troops of developing countries to act to a higher ethical standard than we're asking our own nationals?
I just finish on this. I can only echo and reinforce what you say. It's early days in the, if you like, the tenure of the new Secretary General. I recently had the chance to meet the new head of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, which is just new in the job. And my sense is that he, early days still, is very much aware of what you just pointed out, and it is going to be a priority. But it requires overcoming some of these structural deficiencies to addressing these issues. But I think it is at least recognized as an issue that needs urgent attention.
Thanks very much. I might just quote a sentence from the essay we have in this year's Armed Conflict Survey 2017, exactly on the subject of conflict-related sexual violence, that illustrates, I think, the depth of the problem. In a UN report published in March 2016, investigators noted indications that government-allied militia groups in South Sudan were being allowed to rape women in lieu of wages, suggesting that rape was evolving from a practice to a policy. So that's just one illustration of the many in this essay of how severe the problem has become and how urgent it is to resolve. Next. Yes, sorry. We'll just wait 2 seconds for the microphone.
Thank you. Skander Kane's Office of Crispin Blunt. Dr. Shinman, I wanted to ask, you said that more conflicts bear the hallmarks of intractability. And I was just wondering whether in this publication you developed a formal framework for testing whether a conflict is intractable or whether, and what that framework looks like, if there is one, or whether it's more common sense analysis on a case-by-case basis. Thank you.
Anastasia?
This is perhaps the subject of a future essay for next year's book. In this year's book, we just note in the conflict-specific chapters that many of the conflicts are developing signs of intractability. As mentioned before, these certainly include Mali, Ukraine, some conflicts in India. We hadn't developed an analytical framework yet, specific analytical framework yet to account for the different levels of intractability, but perhaps that is the subject of a future essay in next year's edition.
Good, thank you very much. So 2017, it's common sense, and 2018 we'll have the methodology to support the gut instinct. Yes.
Richard Norton-Taylor, could I press perhaps Emil Hockayam on the future of Syria? You said it's more fragmented. Could you say a bit more of the chances of Syria remaining a unitary state? Also, separately, the future of the Kurds in all these countries.
Very challenging question. I spend my days thinking about it, and to be honest, there are so many conflicts happening at the same time in parallel in Syria, clashing, overlapping. Some of them are frozen for some time while specific actors focus on another threat. I think Syria, it's not just the current conflict that we should worry about, it's also the latent and the upcoming ones. The problem with the fight against ISIS is that it serves essentially as a guise, a pretext for various parties to advance their own interests. And we see it right now. I'm going to give you an example. We all focus on Raqqa and northern Syria, or Mosul in Iraq, but there is a big fight against ISIS happening in southern Syria, where actually Free Syrian Army units, in the very loose branding there, supported by Jordan and the US, etc., have made quite significant advances in the Syrian desert in the past few weeks. In the past couple of days, the Assad forces have attacked those rebel units that fought against ISIS. So now those rebel units are turning against Assad, which actually gives ISIS a break in southern Syria. In northern Syria, the picture is extremely complex and actually can lead to serious conflicts. And first between the Turks and the Kurds of the PYD, between rebels, whether they're tribal elements or Islamists, etc., against Kurds, between those rebel elements and Assad. This is the ongoing fight. Idlib is a killing zone at this point. And at the same time, what you do have is some more clarity about the regional interests of the neighbors. And so essentially today, aside from ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, which is today Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, almost all other forces, including Assad, are proxies for someone else. Whether it's the Syrian rebel forces, the Assad regime itself, the Shia militias, the more Islamist groups, or the Kurds are their own entity, but essentially the Kurds have been very competent and performant, largely because of international support. So the picture is kind of clarifying, but it's not clarifying in any satisfactory way, obviously. It's very difficult to precisely define those zones of control. It's very difficult to explain what the interactions between those various zones will look like. Certainly, Bashar al-Assad has not relinquished his dream of taking control over the whole country, which looks more plausible this year. I would still say not very likely, but still more plausible than it was before. So no, the future of Syria is very much in question. I would just challenge people not to think in terms of just state in Syria. I mean, this notion that however distasteful the Assad government represents the state, to survive this massive existential challenge, Bashar al-Assad has had to accept the militiafication of the regime, to accept the development of all these militias that don't challenge his rule, but challenge the coherence of his regime. And that makes him very difficult. It makes it very difficult for him to reassert himself as the dominant force over all of Syria. So I still think this is a conflict that has fuel to run for a few more years.
Before you move on to answering the general question on the Kurds, can you say a few words on the Astana proposal for safe zones in Syria and your judgment on them?
I think it's the Astana process is essentially a competitor as well as complementary to the Geneva the UN is animating. I mean, I heard what Professor Bertzel said before, and that for me is a very clear case where the UN is actually struggling for relevance. At times it looks like the more realistic, reasonable actor, but it's really in Astana that the guys with the guns are sitting and striking deals. Astana is interesting for a number of reasons. I think the most important one is the absence of the United States. And that tells you a lot about how that conflict has developed over time. Is Astana a framework for total de-escalation in Syria and reaching a political solution, whatever that is? I doubt it. It's a place where important regional and international actors, i.e. Russia in this case, can basically calibrate their interests, seek to reconcile them, but not necessarily in a totally sustainable manner. This idea of safe zones is very complex, but also still very hazy. First, it actually prevents the United States from operating in Idlib. Second, it demands that Russia, Turkey, and Iran guarantee the escalation in specific zones. By the way, not all zones. That's very important to note. And I don't understand the mechanisms of enforcement. Does it mean that Turkey would have to send troops or monitors on the ground? But Turkey is seen as an invader or external actor by some. Same thing with regards to Iran. Iran is seen by Syrian rebels as an invader. What about Shia militias aligned with Iran? Are they enforcers of the ceasefires, or are they fighting parties? So I still think Astana is an extremely problematic process, although I think it has more chances of working than Geneva. And finally, on the Kurds, first, the PYD are not all the Kurds. It's the most competent, organized unit there. And certainly, there is a level of, there is a lot of Arab chauvinism that explains Kurdish grievances, etc. There's also Kurdish hubris in how they think about their territory. I mean, you hear Kurds today thinking this is their moment, so let's go all the way to the sea. I mean, you hear Kurds talking about possibly going to Idlib. I think this is an unacceptable existential challenge to Turkey, and Turkey has proven that it will ignore US advice in this regard. Now, Turkey can be punished, obviously, but the question is it worth it? What does it do to NATO, etc.? Sorry, it was long, but that's how complicated Syria has become.
Desmond Bowen, just wait 1 second for a mic, which will...
Thanks very much. Desmond Bowen, IISS member. I'd like just to go back to some of the things that Matt said, and particularly about kind of reinforcing the political effort of the UN. So not just, as it were, the kind of protection of civilians, but finding solutions. Mediation, I think, was the word that you used. And it does seem to me that actually finding political solutions is the real problem, and there's less willingness for smaller groups to submit to larger groups, and so they take up arms and fight. But the question in relation to mediation, if Guterres is to move the UN in that direction, of course, how the UN Security Council views all this is a separate matter and a problematic matter. But do you, Matt, see mediation being combined with a more forceful UN implementation and imposition of solutions? I mean, do those things go together? Or is this meetings in Geneva, maybe Astana, maybe elsewhere? Or is this the UN imposing a solution after a period of time of seeking some kind of compromise?
Matt?
Yep. Big and important question, and easy or difficult to answer in a short space of time. I think, so again, telegraphically, I mean, the UN is not and never has been and never will be in a position to impose a solution by external means or by use of force for external means. So what I'm thinking here about is to find opportunities for encouraging and supporting a political process. So the UN's activities in the field, whether they are security sector reform, demobilization, humanitarian relief, should be geared towards supporting some kind of political process. Now that sounds much easier in theory than it is in practice. What do I mean? I think there are two things. First of all, at the micro level, UN mission headquarters in the field have to try to leverage their presence to support the political process. In many of these cases, all they can do at the moment is to run around and do, if you like, ban aid protection, totally divorced from any political process. And that's why, to pick up on what John said about intractable conflicts, these conflicts become intractable. And again, to answer the point about states and fragile states, the UN becomes, in a way, part of the problem. So the mission itself, with instructions from New York, from the Department of Political Affairs, which needs to be beefed up, has to focus on finding what we call, again, fancily, inclusive political settlements. Now, what does that mean on the ground and in practice? Of course, it does mean you've got to, first of all, you've got to invest more political effort within a particular process. In the DRC, as many have said, it's been a kind of an orphan conflict. We have provided troops, but we have done very little in terms of supporting a political process. And that not just locally, but it is within the region. You've got to involve Kigali, you've got to involve Kinshasa, and you've got to try to see if you can broker some kind of settlement between key actors in the region and also if you like, the protagonist within the conflict itself. Now, the longer these conflicts last, the more difficult it becomes because UN's presence becomes a kind of a waning asset. And as I said, the number of armed groups in Congo has increased, partly in response to a changing political economy, new opportunities. People are engaged in survival, in criminality, and so on and so forth. Again, the issue of criminality, I know there are others on the ISS working on this, is part of the problem of intractability. So again, when I talk about political mediation and focusing on the political routes, is trying to identify what are some of the political pathways out of conflict. Sadly, very often we are creating perverse and unintended consequences by our intervention, making that more difficult. I don't think there is any appetite for large-scale UN missions anymore, and I think Guterres might be right in his desire to scale down these missions. Whether it's 15,000 or 20,000 in the DRC, frankly, doesn't make much difference. What you need to do is to approach this ultimately as in the first instance, as a political problem that involves the region and the local actors. And again, that brings us back to, what the UN has a comparative advantage. I think quality of personnel and staff. I know it's very difficult in the case of Geneva. It has been marginalized. But there are individuals which in the past, whether it is Brahimi, Sergio Di Mello, Alvaro de Soto, people who have a proven track record in trying to bring, if you like, parties together and get some sort of movement forward. Otherwise, I think we'll be back again next year with the same kind of intractable problems. But that, I think, is where the focus has to be.
Yes? Oh, all right. Gaynor first, and then your neighbour after that. Gaynor.
Hi, Gaynor Roberts, IISS. A question for Antonio. Wondering how the Trump factor will influence Mexico's approach to its conflict.
Well, thank you, Gaynor. So I think that the main threat of Trump to the security in Central America and Mexico, the conflicts that we follow at the Armed Conflict Survey, is in the form of foreign aid. So the budget of USAID was the single most affected U.S. institution or government institution that with the budget cuts that Trump did on the State Department and to benefit the defense spending, the defense budget. So it's not clear yet how that money will be distributed across USAID. So far, the U.S. has a major aid program to Central America called the Alliance for Prosperity in the Northern Triangle, and that is in response to the major humanitarian, if you will, but certainly a refugee problem that came in the form of unaccompanied children that numbered around 70,000 in fiscal year 13-14, and then reduced a bit, and then last fiscal year, again, a huge increase in unaccompanied children and not to mention adults going to the U.S. The Alliance for Prosperity is a broad institutional peace-building urban development project for the three countries, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And so far, the resources are being distributed, are being dispersed, but if aid is cut in coming years, that there's a serious risk that the institutional reforms that are starting will be halted.
Thank you.
It's Rob Sanford, Army officer, just picking up on the theme of major powers and also previous mention of sort of proxy conflicts, given that the sort of prevailing opinion of the challenge to the international order is coming from assertion of major powers and great power play. Do we see sort of evidence emerging of an instrumental approach by the great powers in regional conflicts, particularly the intractable ones? And if so, what are the likely ways of this playing out in the coming years? Thank you.
Matt, you look at the UN Security Council, so you look at 5 great powers at least. Have a crack at that one.
Well, I think there was, of course, a great deal of alarm with the Trump election about where the UN would be heading, and a lot of the initial concern was that it would be a sort of slash and burn tactics, cut down missions. There was an executive directive which wasn't in the end issued after Nikki Haley took a bit of time and realize that might not actually be in the US interest to go about it that particular way. There's also been an internal debate clearly within the administration where one of our colleagues, but someone like H.R. McMaster, who's now National Security Advisor, is no ideologue. He has a clear sense of the US interest, but I can well imagine him being the sort of person who might ask tough questions about how the UN can act as a service agency for the US and for the international community. All of that to say, to qualify slightly the concern that it's sort of all over. And of course we see recent election results which buck the trend. So you could argue that this penchant that people talk about for transactional diplomacy, what you might call a more instrumentalist approach, might not necessarily always be such a bad thing. Certainly historically, where the UN has been successful in operations has been where one country, partly for reasons of national interest, has taken the lead. Australia and East Timor, United States and Haiti back in 1994. But of course, ultimately, there is an issue that UN activities are values-driven. I mentioned the point about mass atrocity crimes. And unless you think mass atrocity crimes is something that needs to be addressed, you might be instrumental in your approach of doing it. So I think the picture isn't quite as black and white as you might have thought at the end of last year. And I think some countries, and maybe this is an element of hope, might find that the UN, for all its faults, particularly the Security Council, might be an area where you can work out compromises that both serve, if you like, the conflict itself, but also member states. And one of the paradoxes of what I've said, in spite of the element of crisis, is that the demand for UN operations is still very, very high. Just a month after the annexation of Crimea, all Security Council members agreed to send 12,000 troops to the Central African Republic, which would look odd, but partly because it served their own interests, they're parking a difficult problem, but also I think because they felt we couldn't have, if you like, another genocide in an African republic. Again, we go back to Libya in 2011. Sarkozy is famously reported to have said, this is not about the R2P or responsible protect, this is about avoiding another Srebrenica in North Africa. Of course, we didn't think about the consequences, what you do afterwards, but that was the reality. So we are in a very strange, you might define it as tragedy, that we feel we ought to do something, but we're not always prepared to do it. But it makes for a very complicated picture. We could go on about the other members of the Security Council, but I do think Security Council politics is very interesting at the moment, and in some ways people are clearly looking after their interests, but a country like France and a country like the UK, for them the Security Council is a very important club to be a member of. They wouldn't want to see it needlessly weakened. So you can see, particularly the UK, perhaps after Brexit, feeling that this is something we should prioritise and invest time and effort in. Hence a meeting later this week on Somalia, which the UK have taken the lead in. So the trends are working in both directions here. But you are right to emphasize that countries set the tone in the US, are thinking about their own interests. But I think we perhaps need to get away from the sense that it's either principle or either interest. The two can come together, and the place to bring them together might sometimes be the United Nations.
Two more questions, then we close. You first.
Martin Kettle. My question is, I think, probably mainly for Emil, but it might be for some of the other contributors. Does your look at armed conflict in the world today make you draw any conclusions about the progress of the radicalization problem? And is there anything to report on strategies for countering it? If there's nothing in the report about that, I'd be interested in hearing your views anyway.
Thanks. We'll take the second question and we'll come back. You, sir? Can you just wait for the microphone to come up to you? If you reach back, there you go.
Thank you very much, sir. Just wondering, who is fighting in the low insurgency battles in northern Sinai? And what is the objective? To topple the state? They are not going to achieve that goal. Is it a fight against Israel? And the connection with Daesh, or what you call ISIS or ISIL, whatever, they are not, we know that they are not from Daesh. They just jumped on the bandwagon in order to have credibility. Thank you.
Just on the first question, I would note the appearance in the 2017 Armed Conflict Survey of an essay by our senior fellow, Nelly Lahoud, based in our Middle East office, on the Islamic State shifting narrative. And that essay, I think, points out how the Islamic State is coping with the loss of territory while still trying to keep its prestige up with those who it continues to seek to radicalize in its cause. Emil?
The insurgency in the Sinai has moved from a low-level insurgency to a medium-level insurgency, and it's actually challenging the state in quite powerful ways. I mean, the groups there are mounting pretty impressive. I mean, the stateful operations. Yeah, exactly. But it's a long-running one. So as you said, these are groups that existed before, based on socio-economic grievances and political grievances for long. They saw Daesh develop and they essentially became a franchise. They now present themselves as an ISIS province. And essentially, I think the very hard way the state has combated the insurgency has only served to escalate that. So there are serious parts of the Sinai that are too dangerous today. And we all have in mind the airliner that was brought down from Sharm el-Sheikh going to Russia a year plus ago, 2 years ago. So they are challenging the state. I don't think that they are posing an existential threat to the state, and they haven't yet really challenged Israel. I think there is a lot of cooperation between Egyptian and Israeli intelligence to prevent this from happening. The question is whether they can link up with other criminal groups or with extremist groups in Gaza, etc., to escalate the situation. Ultimately, this is just an example of how bad governance somewhere actually fuels the development of local resentment that then invites external or jihadi interference, which take that insurgency to the next level. I think there are other ways to deal with the Sinai province problem than the one that the Egyptian state has adopted, which is a very tough security-first approach.
Thanks very much. And there's an extensive treatment of Wilayat Sina in the Armed Conflict Database between pages 85 and 87, the Armed Conflict Survey. But I said Armed Conflict Database because I wanted, in closing this discussion, and thank you very much all for coming, to alert you not simply to the fact that this book summarizes our analysis on all the ongoing armed conflicts in 2017, but it really is based on and draws on from the data that every week we update on our electronic database, the Armed Conflict Database, and there are a couple of terminals there that perhaps a few of you who have some time might like to have a look at. Thank you very much to the editor and to the contributors, especially Max Burdell, who's joined us today, to the Armed Conflict Survey, and to all of you for joining us today, and I hope you find it both a useful and interesting read. Thank you very much.